Every once in a while, I get invited to do something related to my book, and I want to tell you a little bit about it because it's relevant in this sense. Well, if you the title of my book is "Bitten by a Camel," and the subtitle is "Leaving Church, Finding God." I don't particularly like that subtitle. I don't mind leaving church, but I just think it's like a bit presumptuous. But that's marketing, out of my that the publisher titled. So anyway. You don't expect to be invited to churches when the subtitle of your book is Leaving Church. So a church in Atlanta invited me, and I thought, well, okay, let's go. And it was amazing because it was really more of an interview than anything else. We sat there on a Sunday, and the pastor just interviewed me. And then we did an event at night, too. And what was amazing to me was that it's a reminder that the world is changing wildly and rapidly. And I think about this community, this place, this particular assortment of human beings, and it can feel, because Grand Haven, let's just be honest, is not like the progressive capital of the United States, all right? It can feel somewhat isolating and like you're an island out here all by yourself, but actually, there's a whole underground network, like the fungi that connects trees. There's a whole underground network of people who are, in one way, shape, or form, leaving a bit of their worldview and entering into the tumultuous process of change and evolution and growth, which is terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. And hopefully, new, more generative, gracious communities are being formed in the wake of all that. And in some ways I think about C3 as kind of a precursor to some major cultural shifts that are happening in religion, spirituality, and faith. And not just there, but I think it's important to name. And this community was one of those places. I mean, here they are, they have a church, they have a communion table, they have songs that talk about God, and yet there are so many people who are curious and disoriented and wondering what's going on in their own personal stories, but also culturally. And they're really hungry for stories of meaning and depth and connection, and wondering if there's something on the other side of upheaval. And like we started with the Buddha quote here, just as a snake sheds its skin, so we must shed our past over and over again. And I know for a snake that probably just feels fine, but as a kind of symbol for us, that is painful. And you think, on one level, I'm dying here and I don't know what's going to happen. So I just want to remind you that who you are, just by being who you are, is needed in the world. And I think this underground network of communities of change is happening whether we're conscious of it or not. And last week was a reminder of that. I was like, here I am with people in Atlanta, in the Bible Belt, And this poor pastor, I have my own story of change. You can read about it in my book, now available on Amazon. But I have to be honest about it, that there was one part of me that always had sort of one foot in and one foot out, even from a pretty early age. But this kid, he's in his 30s. I guess I can say that because I'm over 30 now. But anyway, he was all in, all in. Evangelist, saving souls, 37 salvations next week, or last week, maybe this week, and get it up to 40, all in, turn or burn, kind of heaven or hell, and was doing pretty good, and until he just couldn't do it anymore. And when you're all in and you start shedding your skin, it is terrifying. So somehow he went through it and is still going through it, shedding skin, and people are going with him as they share their own stories of shedding. And of course, a lot of people are giving him the spiritual finger and heading for the exits. So, you know what I mean. I don't know why that was funny, but I didn't even mean it to be funny. So I'm really excited about this month. This month is, I want to talk about change, and I want to talk about personal change and transpersonal change, cultural big changes, and also interpersonal changes, which I don't think can be separated at all. Like Gandhi says, be the change you want to see in the world. So you have to have the interpersonal inner conversation as you also have to have the external forms conversation. So, yeah, and in a way I want to elaborate. I really enjoyed our The Good Life series. I hope you did. And right at the tail end of that, at least my contribution, I mentioned the Rilke poem, I live my life in widening circles. Remember that line? I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. And that widening circle, another image or metaphor for that is change. What does that look like for this spiral to be, swinging out? And I want to talk about patterns of change, and I'm going to try to talk about processes of change, which is a lot harder. Sometimes it's easier to identify the patterns. It's hard to actually identify how one changes in the midst of those patterns. So I guess I'll try to hover around that, at least as kind of a goal. That's where we're going. And I'm excited about this. You may not be. I'm doing most of the talks in May because I'm doing some traveling in June, so I'm trying to pack in a few extras in May. So I'm going to be talking about this for a while. So you'll be ready for a change probably by the end of May. Yeah, so that's kind of where we're heading. And what I'm most excited about is to talk about today Joseph Campbell in a direct way. I mention him all the time. I throw little quotes. And I know many of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell's work. It's even been talked about at C3 long before my time here. So some of this will be review. But it's, according to him, it's the monomyth. So for my time here, so some of this will be review. But it's, according to him, it's the monomyth. Directly at his way of framing this, what he calls the monomyth, or the hero's journey. And I want to give you a couple caveats. Like, I think about today as like a giant introduction to what we're talking about. So we'll see how far we'll even get today. You might feel like at the end, oh, he just kind of stopped. Okay, I'll pick it up next week. So that's kind of what to anticipate. So what was I saying? Caveats. So some caveats. I don't particularly like the phrase hero's journey, personally, because the word hero has been cheapened in our contemporary culture, and it tends to be a bit masculine. So I just want to admit that. It tends to be a bit masculine. In fact, I heard Elizabeth Gilbert, author of Eat, Pray, Love, complain about this one time in a talk I heard her give. And in many respects, her contribution, Eat, Pray, Love, is a feminine expression of the hero's journey, probably without using that particular phrase. So I just want to say that I'm not talking about a male journey. Hopefully I'm talking about something that is transgender in that sense in terms of patterns, but I will also have to say the nuances of the masculine journey and the feminine journey have to be brought forth. And I have my own limitations because I'm a man. So I'm speaking the way I'm speaking, but I just want to acknowledge there are other ways of talking about this, and the feminine story right now, if you can tell, hashtag Me Too, is bubbling up from the deep recesses and has to live out in the world. And I'll try to at least mention some female-oriented images and myths and pictures as I move along. In fact, I just thought of one. Look how convenient this is. All right, look at your bulletins. Is that what you call this? A bulletin? Open your bulletins, and you see there's a map of the hero's journey. This is not exactly what's in Joseph Campbell's book here with 1,000 Faces. It's a slightly different variation of that, but the pattern is exactly the same. And what I want to encourage you to do is to, for some reason I just thought of put this on your fridge, or like whatever. Put this on your mirror and pray to it each morning. No. I want you to become a student of this. That's what I'm inviting us to do. And actually, I'm giving a talk this morning as a student. I'm curious about this. What is true about it? What's true about it? Where do I see this happening? And can I be a co-creator and co-participant in this unfolding process of change? So we're going to study this. So we'll keep referring to it. And I thought, as I was speaking of feminine journey, I thought about the myth, the Sumerian myth of Inanna, who goes on the great underworld journey. She says, I'll be back in 3 days. If I'm not back in 3 days, have my funeral. Now, this is like 2,000 years before Jesus. Just a little reminder, okay? I'll be back in three days. If not, have my funeral. And she goes into the underworld, and she goes through 7 passages of being stripped of everything until the final passage, she's completely naked. And then she can return from the underworld. So don't think that the hero's journey is masculine. Okay, that is a very, very old story. That's a 4,000-5,000-year-old story right there. Okay? All right. So where do we want to, what else am I saying? Again, why should we look at this map kind of directly and carefully? Because I want to say, in some respects, it's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to become students of change. After all, people often refer to C3 as a progressive place. Well, what does that mean? We'd all probably have different definitions of what we might mean by that. We might mean that politically or minor, who knows. But a simple acknowledgement is the word progress, which no matter how you put it is an expression of change, correct? We are a community that is changing, has changed, and wants to promote change. And so we have to become students of it. We have to become students of the pattern. Like, what is it? How does it work? Because, you know, our culture is filled with the illusion of change through material possessions. Like, I could go and buy something and from an external point of view appear to change, correct? Clothes, cars, zip codes, switch football teams, if you're into that sort of thing, you know. That's like a facade, and we all kind of know that's a facade. So we want to be students of the deeper story here. So I think we have some responsibility. And the other thing I want to say along these lines, why become a student of that? Because the invitation is to become a dance partner with the mythic pattern of change. The invitation to become a dance partner of the deeper mythic pattern of change. Now, why am I saying that? Because it's not a linear industrial growth model. I wish this was 12 steps to change your life. It doesn't work that way. You can try it and you will fail. Then you'll start the real journey. So it doesn't work like a mechanistic machine. It's much more like learning to dance. And dance is this strange, there's an art form to it, but it's about energies. It's about responding to the other. No, I'm like saying all this stuff as if I'm like a dancer. I'm really not. But it's this participatory invitation. And that's what we want to become students of. How can we be participants in our own inner psycho-spiritual change and also in the many external invitations we have right now? Because if you are paying attention, our world is massively changing. And some of us would like to see it change into a healthier, more compassionate, gracious, life-giving world rather than change into a more fear, closed, small world. Am I making sense? Okay. All right, what else? Okay. Let's start with like the basics. the basic pattern that Joseph Campbell identifies in Hero with a Thousand Faces has three parts to it, and it's right there color-coded for you. Departure, initiation, and return. Based on, even simpler way of saying it is the life-death-life cycle. The life-death-life cycle of change. Or if you want to go for Buddhism, everything is impermanent. So everything is impermanent. So it is changing. But the nuances here, departure, initiation, and return, seems to be the flow. And it's not just a matter of I kind of left something. I went through trials and so forth and a kind of initiation, and now I'm on the other side of that, and I can kind of return to a privatized life. What Joseph Campbell says is that the return, those who have gone on the journey, return with gifts that have to be given to the community. That in terms of human capacities, male and female, our human capacity for change has something to do with leaving the ordinary world, entering into the depths, but returning to the community to offer what only we can offer to the world in the way in which we can offer it. And here's the slightly scary thing about the hero's journey, is that you can avoid it. Almost anywhere along the way. So it has this dual reality that it happens to you and you can cooperate with it. Does that make sense? It's kind of a paradox. But at anywhere along the way, you can get stuck and never return and never give back. The simplest way of even saying it is an initiated adult is, well, I was going to say the simple, I almost used the phrase transpersonal dedication, that's not very simple, is a servant. Serves the world through the gifts they discovered during this descent time. So I want to put that out there as, if there's a goal, the goal is to be a generative person. To live for something larger than our own personal sort of well-being. Which we should all agree with, because that was basically the general theme of the good life. From all the different people, there was a thread that ran in there that went something along those lines. Being a generative, life-giving person in the world that has a larger vision than their own personal security. So that's like the simple sort of map of the hero's journey. Departure, initiation, and return. And I think what I want to do is maybe just highlight a few stories and sort of themes that come up. And I'll start in kind of a personal story. When I started to get, well, how should I start a personal story? When Christianity, as I was handed it, stopped working, my first sort of path that began to emerge was, well, I've been looking in the wrong form of Christianity. Like, this was kind of news to me, but there was such a thing called world Christianity, and they didn't all look like white evangelicals, white sort of evangelicals, which is largely the people that I grew up with. So I started to get interested in a more global view of Christianity, and I discovered, oh wait, there are other expressions of this thing. And I got interested in Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism, and for a while one of Richard Rohr's books sat on the back of my toilet, Why Be Catholic? Which I think is a funny title for a book anyway. And somewhere along the way, I discovered the person of St. Francis. And I'm serious. I never heard of this guy in my life. I mean, I saw those little statues of a guy with birds. I didn't even know that was St. Francis when I was a kid. I just thought it was like a garden decoration, you know? I never heard of St. Francis. But there was something about him that was attractive and kind of alluring. And he kind of, St. Francis sort of stands in the middle of Christendom. So if Christianity begins with Jesus and all this upheaval and emergence of what eventually became a new religion, it eventually gets very sort of rigid and power-oriented and, you know, the Roman Catholic Church. Until St. Francis. And St. Francis is like a thorn in the flesh of Christendom. Because all of a sudden you have this person in Italy saying, I'm just simply going to take the teachings of Jesus seriously. I'm going to sell all I have and give it to the poor, and I'm going to walk around wearing rags. And he wore rags initially, not like fancy robes that you can maybe order online. They were rags. And he said, I'm going to take love seriously. And I'm going to take peace seriously. He went and tried to negotiate with the Sultan and whoever and the general who was leading the Crusades, because St. Francis happened during the time of the Crusades. He tried to negotiate peace during the Crusades. So he's like a wild sort of figure that stands in the middle of this. And I thought, wow, here's someone who's is touching upon the deeper streams of this spiritual tradition, Christianity. So I was really attracted to this person of St. Francis. And I even carried around a book of prayers, sort of St. Francis's hours, and I would try to keep the hours. I was kind of like obsessed with him. And it was a big part of like my own story sort of opening up. And eventually, I had the chance to go to Assisi. So my wife and I went to Assisi, and instead of my time there being sort of a culmination of the awesomeness of St. Francis, like, I'm here in this place. This is where all these stories happen. What a figure. Inside, I was terrified. I was filled with anxiety about who I am. Like, what is my life? What is this thing called Christianity? At the time, I was a pastor, so I was like worried about vocationally, but it was much deeper than am I in the wrong job? And it's funny to me because I think there's something in this story that I have to work through. That maybe this will be in my second book. I'm not sure. There's something about this story that I have to work through, but the moment I sort of stepped into this place, I felt like an arrow of anxiety, fear, and dread just slicing right through me. Which, as I look at the hero's journey, is the very beginning of leaving the ordinary world and having some, what Joseph Campbell would call to adventure, which kind of sounds like, oh yeah, I'm going to go hike Everest. That's not exactly what he means, but some sort of something calling or cutting through you, communicating. You have in front of you a choice. And the choice is patch up your ordinary world, your way you've constructed your life, or let this arrow cut straight through you and walk toward the unknown. That's what was happening in me. It seemed to be the case. And as I look at this map, something was beginning to pull me down beneath the surface into this sort of mythic kind of initiation and underworld story. And once you're there, you don't know where to put anything. So think about your own life in this sense. Now, your story is wildly, uniquely your story, but think about moments that were like an arrow that seemed to cut straight through you, and seem to be saying something of the way you've been living your life is no longer working. And there seems to be something like an invitation emerging to this underworld that you know nothing about. That is a scary place to be. It's scary personally, and if we can just zoom out for a second, it's scary culturally to walk toward this sort of unknown place. What Joseph Campbell seems to be saying is that's like step 1. I wish that was like step 12. That's step 1. And many of our institutions, religious institutions and educational institutions, want to keep that from happening. Want to keep that kind of wandering or lostness or adventure from happening. Patch up your world and don't go on the journey. Seems to be a sort of underlying message. But to not go is to risk, to jump way ahead to the return, not discovering what you're here to do and bring forth in the world the gifts that only you have. So I was thinking about this story, and I was thinking about the story of Jonah, which when I was a kid, I was told this was a literal story, and Jonah was swallowed by a whale, and we were even given scientific facts. Well, actually, you can survive in a whale because there are air pockets, and you can like eat that. I was like, and I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess you can swallow. Which, in a way, I mean, you have to like credit fundamentalists. They're like, no, we think this is true, and we're going to go to great lengths to convince ourselves that this is true, because that was the only mechanism of truth that we understood, which is to have to be scientific and literal for it to be meaningful. We sort of left the reservation of the mythic world, and it's reaping its own consequences. Anyway, so think about the story of Jonah. And I put in here this, if you look at the front of your bulletin, there's another little passage from Jonah, which I'll get to in a second. So here's the story of Jonah. Here's Jonah going about his business, doing his Jonah thing. And one day he receives a call from God. And God says to Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh. Tiny bit of background. The Assyrians were enemies of the Jewish people. So want to create a contemporary cultural thing? Imagine if someone was told, go to your enemies. Who would you feel? I'm asking you, I'm not going to do it, but what would you put in that category? Who are the enemies? You wouldn't exactly be excited, correct? You'd be like, hey, that sounds great, thank you. Where do I book my ticket? So I'm saying that because Jonah's refusal to go, which Joseph Campbell calls the refusal of the call, is actually quite ordinary. And when I was a kid, I was told Jonah's problem is that he didn't obey God. From a mythic point of view, this is exactly what Jonah should do. He should refuse the call, because then the story gets going. If he's just like a good little prophet, nothing changes. Like, oh, okay, thank you, and goes about his business. But the story begins with the refusal. And there are a lot of good reasons. Who wants to go see the enemy? So he tries to get away from Nineveh, gets in a boat, and sets out. And he's traveling full speed ahead in the wrong direction, so to speak. Until the wind gets involved, and the storm gets involved, or something of the gods, you might say, gets involved and begins to disrupt everyone on the boat. And people think they're going to die. And they say to Jonah, who are you? Here's the passage. The sailors come together. Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity. They cast lots, and the lot fell to Jonah. So they asked him, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? And then they ask Jonah questions that have to do with leaving home, with Jonah's identity up to this point. Look at them. What kind of work do you do? Now, time out. What is the number one question people ask in modern life when they meet someone? What do you do? And I'm in like when people ask me, I'm like in a weird place in life. I don't know what to say, you know? What do you do? Now, why do people say that? Because we think we need ordinary categories to label people so we can situate them. If I say, I'm a pastor, then you get, depending on who you're talking to, then you're like in the bad camp or the good camp, you know? Some occupations are like that. But those are social roles, and start going through them in your mind. Mother, father, president of the United States, teacher. These are roles, correct? But they are very, very important roles culturally. And if you want to use contemporary psychological language, this is part of our egoic personas. I wish it just said, what is your egoic persona? But instead, they say, what kind of work do you do? See, this is one of those probing questions of who am I beneath the surface? Is there anything to my life underneath the roles that I am playing? Like standing in a CC and feeling like an arrow cutting straight through me. Is there anything beneath the surface of the roles that I've worked hard to achieve and do? So who are you? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? Which is almost the second question that we ask people. Where do you come from? Actually, I heard an immigrant. Oh, where was this person from? It doesn't know. Well, it does matter. But they were saying that they were talking about their own ethnicity. I know what it was. It was an Uber driver, and from I think maybe Nigeria, something like that, and had a bit of an accent. And he was describing that when people get into the Uber, they say, where are you from? He'll say, I'm from LA. What's the next question? No, where are you really from? You know? And see, people, like, it's like, where do I need a category. LA is not good enough. You know, I want to put you ethnically somewhere so that I know who I am. That's how the ego works. The ego knows itself by what it's not. And by the way, he was saying in this little interview that in his view, this is a sort of a very racist way of going through life. So just something worth thinking about. Although, as soon as he said that, I thought to myself, I've done that. I mean, I have. That exact scenario. So I don't know what to make of that. Well, I need to go see a therapist. All right. Where do you come from? What's the next question? What is your country? Nationality? These are major identity markers. What's the next one? From what people are you? And see, the question for Jonah really is, what's beneath all that? What's beneath all that? And what might need to be discovered for him to come into his fullest or truest self and way of being in the world? Or is he just going to remain, because he does answer the question, by the way, if you read it, he's, I'm a Hebrew, I'm this, and he starts going through the list. And the moment he says all this stuff, I'm a Hebrew, I'm from here, I'm this, then they say throw him overboard. So you think you know who you are until you're thrown overboard. Which Joseph Campbell calls the belly of the whale. And this is the beginning of the initiation process. So what am I saying so far? I'm saying that initial departure can take many different cultural forms and nuances, that initial departure, but it has something to do with leaving your cultural roles, forms, identity markers, even ethnicities. All the stuff that you've built up for yourself. There's some kind of departure. But you know what it feels like? like something came up out of the deep and swallowed you. I wish it was like, oh, I don't need these cultural forms. I'm free. I'm just going to enter into the initiatory underground journey and just delight in it. It doesn't seem to work that way. The pattern is you get swallowed. And by the way, I jotted down some other swallowing stories. The Native Americans have a story where Raven is swallowed by a whale and taken down. Another one is that this is a Hindu story, but a woman and her children are swallowed by an elephant. This is more of a female initiation story, swallowed by an elephant. Finn, in Irish mythology, is swallowed by a monster, and then the real story begins. And of course, Red Riding Hood, swallowed by a wolf. Okay? So there's something about the mythic theme here that feels like you're being taken over. Something came into your life that swallowed you whole and took you down into the belly of the earth or the belly of the whale, where it's dark and you can't say, yeah, but I'm a pastor. You're just speaking to whale fat at that point. All right? I don't think anyone has said that. That felt like a totally unique moment there. And you're in the initiation. By the way, a reminder, look at your map, look at your bulletin. The initiation part of the story, according to Joseph Campbell, is the longest part. Departure is pretty quick, and the return's pretty quick. Initiation is painstakingly slow. It's a lot longer than 3 days in the belly. Okay. I realize in all my enthusiasm, it's 10 after. Yeah, I told you I was just going to get warmed up, and then it's going to be on to something else. So, okay. Where do I want to leave things? I want to leave things with the Quran. Okay? The line from the Quran is, or do ye think, we'll use the old ye, or do ye think that ye shall enter the garden of bliss? Symbolic metaphor, the return, enlightenment, transformation, true self, soul-initiated adult, fill in the blank. Or do ye think ye shall enter the garden of bliss without such trials as came to those who passed away before you? Nobody gets out of this. And we'll talk more about it next week. Thanks for listening.